Welcome, everybody. Good evening. Thanks for joining us. I'm Bob Luddy. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Andrew Abela, who was nice enough to fly down from Catholic University in D.C. today. He is currently the Dean of the Bush School of Business, Catholic University, and previous to that time, when I actually first met him, he was provost. He's an affiliate of Harvard University Human Flourishing Program and a contributor to Forbes, which we're all familiar with. Based on his research of integrity of the marketing process, that's a new concept, including marketing ethics, another new concept. At one time, for a period of years, he was a consultant with McKinsey. And I was talking to him tonight, how many college deans or college B professors actually worked in the real world for a period of time, particularly in a very, very diverse number of industries, etc. In 2009, he won the Novak Award given by the Acton Institute for his contributions between religion and economic policy. So Acton Institute operates on those two planes, both religion and economic policy. He's written 2 books, including The Universal System for a Successful Life, and one he'll be talking about hopefully tonight is Superhabits, which is the reason some of you came. Dr. Abela provides consulting services to over 100 Fortune 500 companies, so he's quite in demand. He has a Ph.D. in marketing and ethics from the Darden School of Business at UVA. He's married to his wife, Kathleen. They have 6 children, 3 of whom have graduated from Catholic University. Welcome, Dr. Abela.
Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to join you all. I want to begin by talking about trends. There are folks who make their living by following trends or trying to predict the next trend. And in that community, you start to hear the phrase vibe shift. Some of you are familiar. How many? I heard it from one person this afternoon. How many of you have heard the phrase vibe shift? So what is a vibe shift? It's when you perceive some kind of cultural change where the ideas that were previously understood and respected start to feel tired and irrelevant, as they say. And we have been living through a very big vibe shift lately. It dates to just before the election of President Trump and likely contributed to his election. There's a venture capitalist by the name of Santiago Pliego, and he describes this shift as, quote, the speaking of previously unspeakable truths, the noticing of previously suppressed facts, end quote. He goes on to write about the sense of give that, quote, you feel when the walls of propaganda and bureaucracy, and he capitalizes propaganda and bureaucracy, start to move as you push. The very visible dust kicked up in the air as experts and fact checkers, he also capitalizes experts and fact checkers, scramble to hold on to decaying institutions. The cautious but electric rush of energy when dictatorial edifices designed to stifle innovation, enterprise, and thought are exposed or toppled. Fundamentally, the vibe shift is a return to a championing of reality, a rejection of the bureaucratic, the cowardly, the guilt-driven, a return to greatness, courage, and joyous ambition. So far, very positive. The phrase vibe shift was itself coined by Sean Monahan, who is one of these professional forecasters. Over the last 2 decades, Monahan has identified 3 other vibe shifts across a 20-year period, that preceded the current one. There was the hipster movement of the early 2000s, the post-internet techno revival of the early 2010s, and then the woke movement from 2015 onwards. Each of those shifts appear to have only lasted a few years, and so the implication might be that this vibe shift towards reality will also be short-lived, and that in maybe 7 years from now, we'll be moving away from our newfound fascination with reality. I don't think so. I believe that we're experiencing not a 7-year shift, but maybe a 70 or 100-year shift, a major global realignment. I think we're experiencing what Rusty Reno, who is the editor of First Things magazine, calls the return of the strong gods, in a book of exactly that name. And Reno's thesis is that in reaction to the horrors of the 2 world wars of the 20th century, we attempted to replace the strong gods, and these are things like patriotism, faith, truth. He calls them strong gods because these are the sorts of things that people are willing to die for. And we replaced them with weak gods of progress, tolerance, and relativism. Weak gods because it's a rare person who's willing to die for progress or tolerance or relativism. And the result of this change, as Reno is explaining, the result of the shift to the weak gods in the last century has been the atomization of society, the rise of elitist technocracy, and the loss of meaning, the loss of any sense of anything to live for. And so we became a nation of overgrown children who failed to launch, living alone in their parents' basements, letting their lives be manipulated by a few self-appointed experts who tell them what they're allowed to eat, to do, to think, and when they are and when they aren't allowed to go outside. Reno predicted, and we're now seeing, a backlash, the return to the strong gods of patriotism, faith, and truth, the return to reality. So I think he was right to that extent. But he also warned that the strong gods bring with them a whole host of potential problems: authoritarianism, extremism, war. To avoid these, he says, the strong gods have to be tempered. They have to be tamed, so that they lead in constructive, not destructive directions. And the way to tame the strong gods, to make sure that they're used for good and not for evil, for peace and not for war, is through virtue. We need virtues like wisdom, restraint, diligence, and generosity to tame the strong gods. So far, so good. I'm sure everyone here is in favor of wisdom and of restraint and diligence and generosity. The problem is, it usually stops there. A call for virtue is usually just that, a call, an exhortation. Be wise, be restrained, be diligent, be generous. Doesn't really help. It's better than be calling for the opposite, but the call doesn't get you very far. So how do we move from virtue as an exhortation to virtue as something real, as something practical and effective that will actually make a difference in people's lives? And that's what I want to focus on tonight, and that's what in large part my book Superhabits focuses on. And the answer requires us to recover the real meaning of the word virtue. That virtue is not just an exhortation, still less does it mean virtue signaling. I wrote an article for Forbes recently and gave it the title, Virtue Signaling is Dead, Long Live Virtue. And I tried to make the distinction between those two in the article. I pointed out that the original meaning of the word virtue is a good habit, right? Particularly a habit of excellence. And the reason this is significant is if we understand that virtues are habits that anyone can acquire through practice, then virtue is no longer this abstract ideal that we're just aspiring to, but something that we can all do and become. So if you want to grow in the virtue of restraint, for example, every day you practice some small effort at restraint, and steadily you will build the virtue of restraint in the same way that you would build any other kind of muscle. Because the virtues are very much like psychological or spiritual muscles, which are already within us. So there is wisdom, there is restraint, there is generosity, there's courage within all of us. But like some muscles we may have, they have to be exercised to be strengthened. But the positive meaning of this is none of the virtues are foreign to us because they're already within us. They just have to be exercised to be strengthened. Ancient civilizations knew this. So the ancient Greeks and Romans would habituate themselves to virtues like courage and wisdom. They would practice them as well as honor them. The virtues became a sort of human operating system, is how I like to think about them, basically underlying every personal and societal achievement. And this was true for almost every major civilization through the millennia, until about a couple of hundred years ago, when we started to abandon the pursuit of virtue. The philosopher Alistair MacIntyre tells this story in his book After Virtue. At the risk of vastly oversimplifying the book, it's a complex book, but the argument in essence is that virtue had become associated with religion, and particularly with Christianity, and was rejected during the Enlightenment, along with the rejection of many other things religious. McIntyre explained that people in the past shared a clear idea of what the virtues were and how and why they mattered. They were habits that helped people live good lives, guided by tradition and their community. But over time, the Enlightenment tried to rebuild a sense of morality using reason alone. And that project failed utterly. McIntyre argues that it failed because reason alone cannot give you strong, agreed upon, kind of shared rules for how to live. And the result has been a world where people often talk about values and rights and maybe even virtues, but that those words lack any kind of real foundation. McIntyre says that when society lost its connection to the tradition of virtue, we ended up with a kind of moral confusion. Instead of asking what kind of person should I become or what is the good life for human beings, people started arguing only about preferences and opinions. Modern debates about ethics, he claims, sound like people shouting at each other without much common ground. For McIntyre, the way forward is to recover this older Aristotelian tradition of virtue where communities shape people's character and help them live for a purpose. So how do we do this? How do we go about turning this around, returning to virtue, in a sense upgrading or updating the human operating system so that we can tame these strong gods that are upon us? We need to reintroduce the classical idea of virtue into every aspect of society, particularly, I argue, into education and into business. So in education, and I think I'm certainly speaking to the choir here, preaching to the choir, but promoting character education, both at the K-12 and the higher education levels, because one's character, properly understood, is no more and no less than the collection of virtues that one has developed. And that collection of virtues is directly correlated to how successful one is going to be in life, in the broader sense of the word success. But also in business, by showing how formation in virtue of employees actually drives better business results. And that, unlike the claims of DEI and ESG, the evidence is actually clear that virtue does drive improved well-being and improved business results as well. So where is this evidence that virtue leads to human flourishing and to business success? Do we have to rely only on the word of long-dead philosophers? Now, those ancient authorities are certainly worth paying attention to. Even still, we don't have to rely exclusively on them because they are augmented now by extensive contemporary research evidence on the effectiveness of the virtues, scattered across several disciplines. There's a vast literature over the last 30 years or so in psychology, a stream of what's called positive psychology, where they study empirically a whole range of virtues. In organization behavior, there's the field of positive organizations. There's also articles, research from consultants at McKinsey, my old firm, and at Deloitte. And then, of course, there's the research popularized in the habits literature, such as the millions of copies selling Atomic Habits. Any of those millions of copies get sold to any of you? Anybody familiar with that? Yes, everywhere I go, people know that book, Atomic Habits. Now, unfortunately, there's a bit of a Tower of Babel effect, because every one of these different disciplines is using different terminology. So positive psychology writes about character strengths, is what they call them. Positive organizations talks about positive traits. Deloitte's people write about capabilities. McKinsey writes about distinct elements of talent, but they're all using different words for exactly the same thing. They're talking about courage and restraint and diligence and generosity, i.e. the virtues. But even worse, none of them, except the habits literature, make the crucial point that virtues are habits. So they just describe them as these sort of characteristics, and you're left wondering, if I wasn't born with this, do I have any hope? But then the habits literature itself, even though it's very rich in terms of telling us how to grow in habits, says nothing about which habits are worth building. Nothing at all. It leaves it entirely up to you to choose. But it's sort of missing, to my mind, the most important point, which is the virtues are the highest impact habits anyone can develop. So what is the point of giving you a book about how to develop habits and then neglecting to mention, by the way, this particular set of habits are the ones you should be spending your time on? So as I became more and more familiar with these different literatures, I waited for somebody to notice that they're all talking about the same thing and bring them all together. Eventually I got fed up waiting, and so I did the work myself. So that's what the book Superhabits is attempts to bring all of these literatures together and do it in a way that is readable and not boring, like an academic treatise might be. I found the key that unlocked the integration of all these streams together in the writings of Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century philosopher, in his treatise on the virtues, which I think is the best that's ever been written on virtues before or since. And that's at the heart of my own book. One of the important insights that arise from reading Aquinas, certainly arose for me from reading Aquinas, was how we've been limiting our approach to habit development. So people who try to develop new habits tend to stay focused on habits of diet, exercise, and sleep. So all of those of you who read Atomic Habits, if you've been working on a habit, I bet you it's one of those three, right? Diet, exercise, sleep. Yep, that's what we do. Nothing wrong with that, right? Because it's good to have good diet, and it's good to have exercise, and it's good to sleep well. That's all key for our health and our flourishing and so on. So I have nothing against those habits. I try to have them myself. The problem is we usually stop there. That's as far as it goes. But if you think about it, these habits of diet, exercise, and sleep are exactly the habits we share with the animals. Because animals eat, animals move, and animals sleep, just like us. And what Aquinas is showing us is that there are habits that are distinctive to our human nature, habits that only human beings can have. And his work is so important here. And you think, well, has this been lost for 750 years since he wrote it? It hasn't, because many people study Aquinas in great detail. But I think what has largely gone unnoticed in studies of Aquinas is the systematic nature of how he puts all the virtues together. So other books give us lists of virtues, and no two books can agree on what the complete list looks like. Aquinas gives us a sort of complete and not overlapping system, showing us kind of this is the collective sense. These are the virtues, and you may wonder, what's the big deal? So we have different people focus on different virtues. Why is that a problem? So long as everyone's growing in virtue, isn't that be great? Imagine instead that we were talking about chemistry, and that every chemistry textbook you picked up had a slightly different periodic table of elements. So this book has iron, but this one doesn't. And this one has sodium, but it doesn't have hydrogen. It's like, that would make no sense at all, right? How we would have no respect for the discipline of chemistry, and yet we seem to be okay with that for the virtues. If you believed that the list of virtues was kind of anything you want it to be, then the virtues themselves start to become, and I think have become, seen as optional embellishments, like the paint or the wallpaper or the pictures hanging on a wall, not the brick and the wood that make up the wall itself, right? Or I go back to my earlier analogy of the human operating system, right? What we need is not an incomplete framework where we're not sure what is and isn't a virtue, but something that is complete, non-overlapping, a system that says, okay, this is the set of virtues that it takes to be a flourishing human being. And so here's how Aquinas develops the framework. For me, it's analogous to the childhood game of 20 questions. You remember that game, 20 questions? Play it on a car drive, right? If you remember, in case you forgot, somebody thinks of a thing or a person or a place, and then you get to ask them 20 questions, yes, no questions, and within those 20 questions, you have to guess what they're thinking. Yeah. Now, there is a way to win more often than not. Do you remember what that way was? That every time you ask a question, you want to ask the question such that it divides all the remaining possibilities, the universe of remaining possibilities, roughly into two. And if you do that, you're narrowing down from all of the universe to half of the universe to a quarter and so on. And if you keep doing that, almost invariably you're going to get to the right answer, because 2 to the power of 20 is over 1 million, right? It's a very big number. So you'll be able to discern from over 1 million items down to just one by asking 20 yes-no questions. How does that fit with Aquinas? He does a similar thing to life itself, right? Just in case you're still wondering what I'm talking about, Do you remember what the most common question? Is it bigger than a bread box? Right? What do we ask when 20 questions? I don't know if anybody still uses bread boxes, but it's a good question. We know roughly what it would. It'd probably be a little bit bigger than a loaf of bread, right? Would it be a bread box? So if you ask the question, is it bigger than a bread box? If the answer is yes, then you can now eliminate all of the millions of things that are same size or smaller as a bread box. Okay, so that's kind of how it. And then if the answer was yes, then the next question might be, is it bigger than a house? And if the answer is no, then you can eliminate everything in the universe that's bigger than a house. And now and so you keep cutting down. So he does the same thing with human life. And the way it works out is he starts out kind of thinking about all of human life. And the first distinction he makes is spiritual or material. So is the thing, so imagine you were trying to figure out, okay, what's the next virtue I want to look at? Is the thing to do with spiritual or material life? And let's say, okay, it's material. So then you can eliminate all of the spiritual side of life. And then his next question, but if you went in that direction, you would find there are certain virtues related to the spiritual life. And then if you're looking at material life, the next question he asks is it intellectual or practical? And on the intellectual side, there's a set of virtues there as well. And they are the virtues of the intellectual life. So thinking for thought's sake, the kind of thing we do in colleges and universities. Where I focus my book is then on the rest, the practical life, which is kind of the rest of life, which is the everyday living that we all do. So what are the virtues for the everyday living that we all do? And here he makes a really interesting observation. And it's sort of a cheating observation as far as my 20 questions, because he gets to get 3 options, not 2. And he says that if you think about our daily lives, we have our thoughts, our actions, and our feelings. And that pretty much covers everything that goes on all day long. If you think about your daily living, right? Taking out the intellectual and the spiritual side of life just every day, what are we doing? We're thinking, we're taking action, we're experiencing emotions. And those are the things that, in a sense, make us human, because animals don't think. Animals move, but they don't act in the sense of a human. They don't take deliberate action like human beings. And we can debate probably all night long whether animals have feelings. And there are debates about that. Apparently, if you tickle a rat, it giggles, I'm told. So at least in laboratory studies, they find that. So your tax dollars at work, right? So, but I think we would all agree that animals do not have the depth of emotion that human beings have, and they certainly don't have the ability that human beings have to master their emotions, right? Animals are just creatures of their instincts. So thoughts, actions, and feelings. And then he takes feelings and he says, and we can make a further distinction here, that of all the many kinds of feelings you have, you can categorize them into feelings that draw you towards people or things or situations, and those we'll call our desires, right? Feelings for. And then we have feelings against, which would be things that push us away from certain people or situations or things, and we would call those our fears, right? So we have feelings for, which is our desires, and feelings against. So all day, every day, you can boil down our lives to thoughts, actions, fears, and desires. And then he connects those with the 4 cardinal virtues. If you've heard of the cardinal virtues, prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance, those words, like so many words related to virtue, have kind of drifted in meaning. So by prudence, prudentia would be the Latin word, Aquinas meant the habit of making wise decisions. That's not typically what we think of when we hear the word prudence. We think of somebody who's overly cautious. That's not what he meant. So I prefer the term practical wisdom. So the habit of practical wisdom, the habit of making wise decisions. And Aquinas says, well, that's the habit you want to have if you want all of your thoughts to be effective, right? Because when you're thinking most of the time during the day, it's for some decision. What am I going to wear? What am I going to eat? What am I going to say? What am I going to do? All that we're thinking all day is usually to make a decision. So practical wisdom is the habit of making wise decisions. The second one, justice, is what perfects all of our actions. So justice is the habit of being fair to others and treating them with respect. We're supposed to act justly. And so if we have the habit of justice, then everything we do all day long, most of our actions are interactions with others, everything we do will work out reasonably well because we'll be just to other people. Courage or fortitude is the habit not of having no fear, it's the habit of moving ahead despite fear. Because fear is not within our control. Fear just happens, like any emotion. It just happens. But the habit of courage, the virtue of courage, the super habit, as I call them, is the habit of moving ahead even though you feel afraid. And then the last one is what used to be called temperance, but that word now is associated almost exclusively with alcohol or resistance to alcohol. So the original word temperancia meant self-discipline. So it's the habit. The fourth cardinal virtue is the habit of self-discipline, which is the habit. This is again a little different from not what we'd expect. It's not the habit of having immense willpower. It's the habit of choosing rationally when to follow a desire. So you have a desire, you experience a desire. Self-discipline is a decision. Do I follow that desire or not? And I want to distinguish it from willpower, because when you try to willpower your way through life, it can be a losing proposition. Willpower for me is like gas in a gas tank. You can use it up. And then once it's used up, there's nothing you can do. You just have to rest and wait for it to come back, or the same way you'd refill the gas tank. Whereas the virtues, as I mentioned before, so self-discipline as a virtue is more like a muscle, where the more you use it, the stronger it becomes. The more you use your willpower, you just use it up. But the more you use self-discipline, the more disciplined you become. So there's a really important distinction, I think. And what Aquinas is pointing out is that we grow in self-discipline not by stifling our desires, but by tutoring them into better directions. So if I have desires that cause me to do things or draw me to do things that I think would be stupid and I would regret, then every time I say I'm not going to follow that desire, that actually weakens that desire's hold on me, so that desire becomes less. And then other desires I have that I think would be more constructive, every time I reinforce them, every time I follow them, I strengthen them. Psychologists have discovered this, so 750 years after Aquinas was telling us. So for example, if you suffer from vertigo, which I did for a long time, fear of heights, every time you're close to the edge of something high and you go, oh, that's scary, you're just reinforcing the fear. You're reinforcing every time you stand there and go, oh, it's high, doesn't bother me, even if it does, you just kid yourself, it weakens that fear, you see? So growing in self-discipline is more about, let's say, tutoring, reinforcing your desires to put them in the right direction instead of the wrong one, rather than just white-knuckling your way through life, which I think is a very optimistic view, encouraging. Okay, but if we stop there, 4 cardinal virtues, so practical wisdom, justice, courage, self-discipline, you now know why they were called the cardinal virtues, because if you have those 4, you basically have all of your daily life in really good shape. Because your thoughts, your actions, your feelings are well managed. You have the habits of managing them effectively. But each one of those is a heavy lift to develop. So the other thing that Aquinas tells us, and this is where he gets the full system of his virtues, is that each of them has a whole bunch of, call them sub-virtues, if you like, or partial virtues, which are still virtues in themselves. They're still habits in themselves. So for example, for courage, if one wanted to grow in courage, he gives us 4 different types of courage, 4 different virtues that each one sort of rolls up together, they roll up to courage. And he continues making this 20 questions distinction. He says, okay, so you want to grow in courage, you're dealing with fear, dealing with challenges. Are you dealing with a fear of something that is a challenge that's before you that you can tackle and overcome? Or are you dealing with a fear of a challenge that is going to be enduring? For example, you may have a chronic illness and you think, I'm so afraid of this. I'm going to try to get it cured, but maybe I can't. Maybe for some reason I can't. So he says there's 2 different, they're going to have different virtues. For the kinds of challenges that can be overcome, he says, and he's a super practical guy, he says there's 2 ways to overcome a big challenge in life: through hard work and spending money. Makes sense, right? It's just so rational, right? So again, this either or kind of working the way down. And so in terms of hard work, the virtue there is magnanimity. It comes from the Latin mania anima, means big soul. It's the kind of person, it's the habit of bringing zeal to tackle a big issue, a big challenge, right? It's enthusiasm. It's the kind of virtue that we see in charismatic people. But the beauty of it is you're not born with it. It is a muscle like the rest of them that anyone can cultivate just through practice. So that's magnanimity. The virtue for dealing with problems that can be solved by spending lots of money is called munificence. It's different from generosity. Generosity is actually one of the virtues that comes out of justice, in the sense that we all owe generosity to each other to a certain level. But munificence is different. It's the only virtue that not everybody can exercise, because it means giving away large sums of wealth, of your own wealth. There's no virtue for giving away other people's money, right? Just to be clear. But it's, people wonder, it's like, why is it part of courage? Because when you've worked hard to earn a lot of money, it takes courage to part with big chunks of it. It's like, you know how hard you work to. And but it's the kind of virtue we see in great philanthropists, great entrepreneurs, anybody who puts a big sum of money at stake to try to solve a big problem. So those are the two virtues, the two types of courage, if you will, for dealing with problems that can be overcome. For problems that are more enduring, he divides them into physical challenges and mental. So for physical challenges, we have the virtue of perseverance, which is the habit of enduring physical suffering and carrying on doing what you need to do. So you're tired or you're a little bit sick, but the work needs to get done, so you just soldier on and you do that. So that's perseverance. And then for mental challenges is the virtue that I call resilience. In Latin, it's patientia, so it's frequently translated as patience. But unfortunately, what we mean by patience now is like, don't be in a hurry, don't be in a hurry, you know. But what he means by his actual definition for patientia is endurance through long sorrow. So in other words, when you have like if you're suffering from anxiety or depression or any other kind of negative, any other kind of mental suffering, resilience is the habit of moving forward despite that mental suffering. Now look how cool this is. I was talking to a psychiatrist at Harvard Medical School, and he was telling me that the latest version, the best treatment we have for anxiety and depression is called cognitive behavioral therapy. Some of you may be familiar with it. And the latest versions of cognitive behavioral therapy are almost identical with the practice of growing in the virtue of resilience. So in other words, they're teaching people to say, okay, I know you're feeling anxious. I know you're depressed and don't want to get out of bed. Getting out of bed and merely washing your face when you're suffering from depression is an act of courage. It's an act of resilience. And you do that today, it'll be easier to do tomorrow, and even easier to do the next day. And ultimately, that's how you defeat, or certainly you make progress against anxiety, depression, and other mental challenges like that, is by building up this muscle called resilience. Again, it's amazing. 750 years ago, Aquinas is writing this, and our latest psychological science is saying, yeah, that's what it is. You know, that's the way to do it. So that's for courage. For self-discipline, I won't even try to take you through all of them, because he identifies 15 different virtues, different types of self-discipline. Those of you with us tomorrow, I will go into it in a lot more detail then. But what he does is he looks at the types of desires we have, and basically for every type of desire, there is a virtue. So I'll give you an example. There's a virtue for disciplining the desire to know. Well, why would we want to discipline the desire to know? Don't we just want to know lots of things? Yes, we do, but the desire can run in many directions. It can run in the direction of doom scrolling for 3 or 4 hours on your phone, right? His argument is, now he wasn't talking about phones because they didn't have them those days, you know, but the idea there is, if you spend your desire to know on useless stuff, you're really wasting a precious fuel. Because the desire to know can get you to do great things and to learn great things. So there's a virtue, the virtue of diligence is what disciplines the desire to know. And diligence, again, just like I was talking about self-discipline in general, is not a matter of like, bear down, study, work hard. That's not what diligence is. Diligence, according to Aquinas, and according to the latest research in education, who was, again, rediscovering what he told us 750 years ago, diligence is cultivating that desire to know and directing it into more productive ways. So take your natural curiosity, and instead of wasting it on mindless kind of surfing, focus it on something that's going to be useful to you and useful to others. And the way to do that is to find the things that are inherently interesting in the thing you need to be studying. So for students, for your homework, figure out, if I learn this homework, how is it going to help me? How is it going to help me help other people, for example? What can I find that's interesting in it? And so you're fueling your natural curiosity so that you actually get to the point where you want to study and you enjoy to study this. And that's the sort of the super in Superhabits, right? The superpower that comes from the virtues is as you practice them, they make you enjoy doing what is going to be good for you and good for others. Enjoy doing what you should be doing, you know. There's a religious joke that a friend of mine likes to tell. He says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was no. You know, it's like and it just makes religion seem like a real downer. It's like, oh, everything I want to do is not allowed. It's such a drag, you know. But the joy of virtue is realizing that when you want to do things that are going to be destructive to you and those around you, as you grow in virtue, you'll no longer want to do them as much. And instead, you'll want to do the things that will be good for you and good for others. What a great way to go through life, right? Wanting to do all the right things. No wonder they say, the ancients told us that the happiest people on earth were virtuous people. And the modern scientists are also confirming that. When they do studies, they find as people grow in virtue, they actually become happier. So I gave you the one example of diligence. Let me leave you with a couple of sort of practical suggestions. So if you have a copy of my book and you haven't read it to the very end, you can cheat, and at the back there's a big fold-out diagram of all these, of Aquinas' entire system. If you haven't bought the book yet, you can go online to Amazon. Just kidding. I have a Substack, which is what we call blogs now, superhabit.substack.com. And you can download a PDF copy of The Wheel and see that all there. There's also an app. I had a venture capitalist approach me and say, could you develop an app for these super habits? So we did that. The app is free. There's a premium version, but the free one works very well too. The app is called Grow Virtue. Put the two words together, Grow Virtue. It's in the Apple App Store and in the Google Play Store. And I didn't develop it myself. My son actually developed it. We're in business together. He's a computer engineer. And what the app does is it gives you a diagnostic questionnaire and then rates you on all the virtues, just for you. You don't have to tell anyone else. And makes a recommendation about which virtues you might want to be working on. And then it has an AI coach where you can ask it to give you advice on how to develop the virtue. And you can, this part I love, you can negotiate with it. If it gives you something too difficult, you're just like, no, I can't do that. Give me something easier, you know? And it will. And then the best thing is it will remind you every day to do the thing that you decided to do. Because we grow in virtue by knowing about the virtues, but then by practicing. So every day. So just give you a very practical example. As a young man, I struggled terribly with orderliness. I was always leaving my assignments at the very last minute, you know, and my room was a mess, my car was a mess, whatever. But over the years, I had to learn, and I grew in the virtue of orderliness, which is one of the types of self-discipline. But there was one part of my life that was still disordered, and that until recently, and that was waking up in the morning. The first thing I did, so that my early morning routine was get up, I use my phone as my alarm clock. Alarm goes off, pick up the phone, start checking email and text and so on, and see what fresh hell I have to deal with today. You know, and I realized it was starting me off in a bad way every day. And so I used the app to say, okay, I want to grow in orderliness with respect to my morning routine. And so I decided, and with the help of the app, that I would get up, turn off the alarm certainly, but then put the phone back down, and then I would do my exercises, and I would pray, and I would shower, and only then would I go start checking my emails. It took me about 3 weeks to make it a habit. Now the app really helped because it sends you this reminder. So basically the alarm would go off and I'd look at the phone and the reminder would pop up right away. It's like, put the phone back down. Okay, right. But the point is where for the first few days it's like, I want to check my email. I feel like even though there was usually bad news in there, you know, it's like, I would always want to, right? Because that was the habit I had. But after 3 weeks, it's like, it's not an effort anymore. Isn't that great? You know, so that's, again, the power of habits, but also the power of the virtues in particular. So let me close with, so that's the app. One last thing. The other thing we're doing with the app is working with companies so that you can, the employees all fill out their own private information. nobody sees that except themselves, but what we can see is the aggregate. So you can see what virtues are the biggest weaknesses in this particular team or company or division, and then work together on a particular virtue. Because when people are working together on a virtue, they rise more quickly. Virtues, like vices, are contagious. So when people are working together to grow in a particular virtue, they all grow faster. So that's kind of neat as well. So these are sort of practical ways, because I didn't want to stop at the, okay, this is nice virtue theory, but what do we do? So I'm trying to kind of be very clear in terms of what we do. To close out, I want to point out, so in Atomic Habits, perhaps the most important point that the author, James Clear, makes is that in order to establish a new habit, you have to change your self-identity to incorporate that new habit. So he will have us repeating, for example, I am the kind of person who doesn't snack between meals, for example, if that's the habit you're trying to build, So you just keep repeating it so that it becomes part of your identity. Aquinas actually says something similar, that while acquiring a new habit, a new virtue, it requires repeated practice. It also requires, for Aquinas, a clear view of the goal or end that you are aiming for, the kind of person you are trying to become. But Aquinas then goes even further. It's not beyond identity. He points out that as we grow in virtue, we don't just change our identity, we actually become physically a different person. And he refers to virtues as second nature for that reason. He's, again, writing this 750 years ago, but once again, contemporary science, in this case contemporary neuroscience, is proving him right, because what he's referring to is what we now call neuroplasticity, where our brains actually change shape. So they can develop new connections within our brain as a result of habit formation. It happens much faster and more easily, as you would expect, with younger children, but it carries on throughout life. No matter your age, you can always rewire your brain through the development of new habits. And so we become, in effect, new, better, more effective, more flourishing people by growing in the virtues. So my campaign is to promote a restoration of virtue in this land in order to tame these strong gods, ensure that their power serves the good, so that this return to reality is marked not by domination, but by integrity, and not by chaos, but by character. So I invite you all to join me in this crusade. Thank you very much.